Okay, all right. In presenting my topic, I depart from a short summary of the main theoretical disputes surrounding the concept of autonomy. In the next step, the core question will be addressed. The question is context-specific, and it asks about the possibility of and meaning of liberal autonomy in a society whose past is marked by mass regime-sponsored and sometimes widely supported crimes. Okay, the standard account of autonomy, with apologies to all of you who know much more than me, I'm not a philosopher, about the concept of autonomy. The standard account is deceptively simple. Autonomy means self-rule, ability of a person to lead her life following her own reasons, preferences, motives, and desires. It implies that the autonomous person's life should be free of external forces that she sees as opposed to her own choices. Recall the famous phrase of Joel Feinberg, "I am autonomous if I rule me and no one else rules I." Autonomy is routinely recognized as one of the foundational features of liberalism, and liberalism apparently derives the status of the individual, character of societal relationships, political obligation, and legitimacy of political authority from this concept. However, it is not entirely clear how this is supposed to work. There are many questions to address. Theoreticians who study autonomy are aware of the ambiguities of the concept, and many disagreements, as you know, unfold, pertaining to the nature of autonomy, its conditions, elements, and the conceptual relevance or irrelevance of the social and political context in which persons live. Neither is the relationship to the apparently related concepts always sharply delineated. Think of liberty, sovereignty, identity, authenticity, self-reflection, responsibility, or free will. They're all somehow employed when we talk about autonomy, and nobody knows what is supposed to explain what, right? And so we operate with concepts which in themselves require elucidation. So it's typically, as you know, argued that autonomy first requires the capacity of a person for cognitive and normative reflection. Second, one should be in control of one's choice and actions in accordance with one's self-perception. So we have two conditions, capacity for reflection and control, and these two conditions are sometimes summarized in the notion of authenticity. The core individual traits and the actions chosen and performed shape and express person's true identity. Of course, we also know that the problem of what identity means in the context of discussions about autonomy is also always very perplexing. Recall also that the standard approach is internalist or subjectivist. Cognitive and normative capacities and choices of a person are set mainly in the terms of personal psychology. These theories also tend to see autonomy as empty of any content that could be prescribed either for any human being or for a particular person in a particular situation. This refusal to include substantive and normative features is presented as a necessary step in protection of the very core of the individual self-governance. Now, this internalist proceduralism is an intuitively strong proposition because it argues that the self-government requires a person's sovereign choice of beliefs and actions in determining the meaning and course of her life. However, there are problems. First, to me, this approach is excessively individualistic. It sees other individuals, social context, and political authority principally as threats that should be kept at bay. Second, its persistence on the procedural independence, claiming that making sense of one's life is incompatible with social, ethical, or universalizable moral commitments that would be expressed in normative or substantive terms, comes at a price that appears to be too high. In this reading, an almost exclusive focus is on the genesis, conditions of autonomy, which is supposed to result somehow, but I have to admit I don't see really how, in human condition respectful of one's identity and authenticity. And Harry Frankfurt's famous hierarchical attempt to make sense of all this intuitive appeal and mess, Harry Frankfurt's attempt fails, which also holds good for Gerald Dworkin's attempt. One claim I want to defend is that the qualities of the standard internalist approach, excessive individualism, lack of substantive normative reflection, and proceduralism understood as the defense of content-free neutrality, reduce autonomy to a kind of meta-concept that is ultimately incapable of accounting for the requirement of self-rule that it aims to explain and promote. In defending my claim, I will depart from two trivially obvious points that, of course, in themselves are non-philosophical. First, we Assumptively autonomous persons do not live our individual lives in isolation. Recognizing the significance of living together requires more than procedural fairness. No one is ever in a situation to set up fully independent set of rules for oneself. I really find it very curious that the standard account of autonomy leaves this point to one side. We who live here and now are the persons, importantly shaped by the time-stretching narratives, which are individual and social, continuous and discontinuous, economic and political, as well as ethical and moral. There is much more to a person's life than internal reflections. Thus, autonomy cannot refer only to creating conditions for people to make their life pursuits without the interference of others. It is for these reasons that, in positive terms, I side with the relational externalist approaches to autonomy. I understand that Ms. Marianne here?
Not yet.
Not yet, but I understand that he would also be talking about relational autonomy, and I hope I wouldn't be stealing his subject too much. Relationalism does not imply necessarily a communitarian stance. The possibility and meaning of autonomy are not predetermined by a reading that would assign conceptual and normative preference to the social thesis and corresponding collective perspective. Rather, the primacy of the individual perspective follows from the right perception of individuals engaged in different kinds of relationships. Second, in difference to the standard account, I believe that the concept of autonomy has to account for the substantive distinctions between right and wrong, and good and bad. It also has to explain the relationship between right and good. I point here to Joseph Raz, who famously argued that the conditions of autonomy, mental ability, adequacy of options to choose from, and independence should be directed at making it possible for a person to freely pursue the good. Freely pursue the good. Well, it's a very, very strange formulation. Free pursuit refers to the plurality of the conceptions of the good that autonomy requires. But for autonomy to be worthy, the object of an autonomous thought and action should be the good. You cannot autonomously choose you can autonomously choose the bad, but then your autonomy is not valuable, right? You can be an autonomous killer. You can be a person who autonomously thinks about that it would be good to kill somebody, and then you go on and kill somebody, and you are autonomous, but your autonomy is not valuable because you autonomously chose what is bad. So for Raz, it is very important that autonomy is a substantive concept that makes sense only as an engagement with the good. And second, and following from the first, the outline of valuable personal autonomy points to its moral core. Even if Raz is not using terms right and good in the same way, say, Rawls does, but when you read Raz, you see a very important point that claims the precedence of moral autonomy over personal autonomy. So moral autonomy, understood as a set of moral obligations which refer to the treatment of others, has preference over personal autonomy, understood in this classical individualistic sense. Of course, one classical objection against the substantive account says that making certain values the conceptual features of autonomy leads to excluding from the body of autonomous persons all those who reject those values. Additionally, once autonomy is presented as the basis of political liberalism, the critique extends to the claim that the substantive account violates the principle of state neutrality. I would not engage with these arguments in any detail, but I would like to reiterate that the internalist procedural approach wrongly assumes that the substantive value commitments necessarily favor those who already accept those values, hence creating inequality. Also, making certain values the basis of autonomy does not necessarily violate political neutrality. I would like to claim something else. Following Charles Larmor, we need to ask about the character of values and about their exact placement. One way to proceed would consist in arguing that autonomy should not actually be seen as a starting point of the interplay among individuals, society, and politics in a liberal context. The thing is that the substantive approach does not require that values be included into the concept of autonomy as its internal features. It does not require that a person discovers and accepts their authority in the process of self-reflection. It is possible to understand values as antecedent and external reasons that any autonomous person has to take into account when forming her preferences and acting. In other words, Liberal self-rule consists in identifying and accepting reasons that are objectively authoritative. Autonomy consists in responsiveness to reasons, to use Larmore's formulation, which means that morality precedes autonomy. Now, I want to defend what I see as a liberal reading of moral autonomy in a context marked by legacies of extreme, long-lasting, and systemic mass violence. To repeat, for me, autonomy is essentially relational, external, substantive, and dependent on certain objective moral reasons. I open the defense of relational autonomy by arguing that human beings are interconnected. This interconnectedness can be of different kinds, and it can be conceptualized in different ways. Given that practically each of us shares her life experience with other people in society, moral autonomy consists in developing and sustaining the relationships with those people in accordance with certain principles of the right and good. Those principles precede any concrete relationships, and we can perhaps think of them as moral standards, understood here as norms or stabilized directions we use to distinguish between right and wrong, or good and bad, or just and unjust. We ought to be able to recognize those moral standards as our own, regardless of where we belong, what we prefer, or what constraints or a particular context of choice imposes on us. This is the core of autonomy, I think. But how does the claim of relational autonomy fit? One would expect relational autonomy to be context-sensitive, and the offered universalist account insists apparently on dependence on the universalizable reasons only. My introductory response is that the context has to be interpreted in the light of universalizable reasons. But what does that mean? It is only seemingly paradoxical that the focus on universal morality is heavily context-dependent. To begin with, morality is intertwined with social relations. We act in a morally right or wrong way in real-life situations. The purpose of the mentioned moral standards is to orient us in the individual and relational contexts that involve moral questions. In this sense, moral standards are never merely abstract. They are social standards of meaning, and here I'm following Christine Korsgaard. They also stand in a relationship to the group-specific ethical standards. The congruence between morality and ethics is a mark of the decent society. It is normalized into an effective congruence between personal autonomy and constraining rules, with constitutional rules being seen as the formal embodiment of the principle of autonomy. Think about political liberalism of John Rawls, right? However, this formal aspect does not suffice. Both society and individual identity are historical projects. The question is how a society can become, remain, or recover the status of a decent society in face of many challenges. Also, how can an individual become, remain, or recover her status of an autonomous moral person in face of possible challenges? Now, assume that to some of those challenges, society and some of its members have not reacted in a decent manner. The situation that interests me here is the situation of a society and its individual members confronted with historical injustice committed in the name of society, its underlying collective identity, and in the name of its members, past, present, and future. Historical injustice points to misdeeds committed against others, those who are not members or those who are members of a discriminated group in society. The adjective historical does not imply temporal long distance. It merely says that atrocities have stopped. My liberal universalist and obviously non-Kantian thesis is straightforward. Crime is a moral fact, independent of the first person, both singular and plural points of view, that transcends both the merely social and the merely personal. At stake is moral repair, whereby moral repair I understand the re-establishment of the morally right relationships. The question assumes two related forms. First is the connection between historical injustice and legitimacy of today's political regime. Think about justice for hedgehogs, how Ronald Dworkin addresses the question, how can we be a legitimate regime given the continuity of the regime through time and the regime committed very bad atrocities in the past? This is not the question that interests me here. What interests me is the connection between historical injustice and individual moral autonomy. Focusing on moral autonomy in the wake of atrocity, let me point that it is a relational category in a special sense. At stake are individual moral autonomies of two types of actors whose group-specific identities were created by crime. The talk is about two moral communities: moral community of those who share collective identity with victims, short moral community of victims, and moral community of those who share collective identity with perpetrators. I assume that before crime, wrongdoers and victims used to live in a certain moral relationship. In the practice of crime, this moral relationship was changed, and this changed relationship now shapes moral position of the people. After the crime, relationships are shaped by moral inequality and heteronomy. The question is, how do we go from inequality and heteronomy to equality and autonomy? Legitimacy of, I would say that the core feature of moral inequality is that those who share identity with victims have special privileges. Those who share identity with perpetrators have special duties. So those who are harmed have authority to demand that we acknowledge the misdeed. Legitimacy of their claims follows from both the moral fact of crime and their post-criminal condition that can be identified as prolonged vulnerability. And I'm not showing off names. I'm just always afraid that I could be accused of plagiarism. This is why I'm mentioning names here and there. So the concept of vulnerability of victims I borrow from of course, Rainer Forst. So those victimized are not autonomous. They are survivors. As survivors, they are on a very difficult road to autonomy. They are shaped by the death and those close to them and by what they had to go through. I'm chiefly interested in, and I'm close to finishing, in the question of what we in the land of perpetrators, this is the phrase of Jürgen Habermas, wir im Lande der Täter, what we should do about injustice we or some among us committed, or that we were committed, or that were committed in our name. Now, I would claim that rebuilding moral equality requires revisiting the question of autonomy, recognizing moral stakes in this inequality, and legitimacy of privileges and duties is the first step towards re-establishing autonomy. So my liberal question for myself as a person who strives to be autonomous might be as follows: given how other persons were suffering or are vulnerable because of me, what is that I ought to do? And an introductory response might be, I'm autonomous to the extent my attitude to those harmed in my name is the right one. Or the attitudes don't suffice. What matters is not merely how individual actors feel, but how their speech and their actions affect the world they share with others. So the one who refuses to take stock of wrongdoings committed fails in autonomy. Because he or she fails to exercise control over her life. So if I don't think about crimes committed in the name of the Serbian nation, I'm a heteronymous person because I don't have a control over my life. The point is that my life is intrinsically linked to deaths of those killed and to lives of those who survived. So I am indebted. I have duties to fulfill, and I should respond by acknowledging the crime. This acknowledgement is the necessary first step in recognizing the humanity of victims. This is the recognition they were recently denied. To recognize suffering means to accept it as a fact and to evaluate it as a practice that cannot stand the test of moral justification. This is the process in which we convey to the victims that they are our moral peers and that recent denial of their moral status should not have happened. A failure to attend to the duty of acknowledgement has the meaning of the breach of moral norms of mutual respect, reciprocity, and generality. These norms are and should always be commanding reasons for judgment and action. Those who break the norms of respect, reciprocity, and generality cannot be autonomous persons. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about something which is more or less related to liberalism. So I've noticed that in recent years there has been a push for more paternalist policies, both in academia and in public policy. So what I want to develop is a kind of a liberal view of paternalism and set some limits. So I'll start by saying what I'm not going to talk about, and then I'll just make a case between two kinds of paternalist approaches. which I think fit nicely within the liberal framework. So, so one way, the first question that we need to ask for developing a theory of paternalism has to do how to characterize paternalism. So some people think that paternalism is about restricting freedom. Some other people think that it's just about making a negative judgment about people's agents. So that's Jonathan Kwong's. Some people think that paternalism involves a violation of autonomy. That's Shanna Schifrin's. A second condition, so that's how to characterize it. The second condition is what makes it wrong and whether it is always wrong. But I'm not going to talk about that, so I'll just put that aside. The second question a theory of paternalism has to ask is the scope of paternalism. So there are two main ways of thinking about that. So some paternalistic policies are what is called strong paternalism or ends paternalism. What they want to do is to impose certain valuable goals into people's activities. And I think there are very strong liberal arguments against ends paternalism. So one of them is that liberal regimes have to remain neutral about the content of people's conceptions of the good. Whether this argument is decisive is unclear. So you might think that, so Rawls, for instance, thinks that citizens or persons have very strong interest in having a sense of justice and having a conception of the good. And by that I just mean having some sort of autonomy. So you might think that sometimes it's okay to interfere with people's activities in order to promote this fundamental interest. So they are very, very weighty. So that might, for instance, give us reasons to ban people from selling themselves into slavery or for consenting to consensual cannibalism. That might also give us reasons, for instance, to implement moral enhancement that just make people more moral, more liberal, let's say, and just get rid of racist beliefs. So those are important questions. I will talk about something which is less controversial, perhaps, which is the second form of paternalism, which is usually called the means paternalism or soft paternalism. So the idea here is that sometimes we can be paternalistic and help people to do what they have already reasons to do, what they already want to do. Right, so imagine that Mark wants to pass his exams, but then he's also tempted to go to the pub and drink a bit too much. So I decide to lock him in his room so he can study. So I'm not imposing any goals on him. He wants to pass the exam. I'm just choosing the best means for him. So that seems a more liberal form of paternalism. So indeed, in theory of justice, for instance, John Rawls argues that in the original position, people will seek to protect themselves against some forms of irrationality. So he opens the door to these forms of soft paternalism. Now, there is an objection to this form of Rawlsian paternalism. So William Gluck argues that because political liberals have to skew appealing to controversial conceptions of the good, it is possible that some people will reject Rawlsian soft paternalism. So someone might think that, so Mark might think that even though he wants to pass his exam, he values the opportunity to fight against the temptation to go to the pub. He rather prefers to fail the exam and go to the pub than being locked in the room. And that seems a reasonable conception. So that seems an argument against Rawls. The one way to understand that, and usually it's made in the context of banning cigarettes, is that some of these activities are addictive. So someone might say, well, the case of addiction is slightly different. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure there is any specifically unreasonable thing on just becoming addictive. It's kind of imprudent, but it's not necessarily unreasonable. So most of us who drink coffee can testify that sometimes it's better to be addicted and get something good than just forgo addiction and forgo the good. So the question is, how could we reply to this objection? So one possibility is just to insist that giving people what they want is sufficiently important. You just discount these other interests and say, well, what matters is that people have this match between their preferences. I think that might be all right. But I want to think about another possibility. So one idea is that it would be fantastic if we could find a form of paternalism that doesn't target Mark, that lets Mark do whatever he wants, but that targets those who do want to pass the exam and don't value fighting against the temptation to go to the pub. Nudging seems to be one of these examples. So many people have said that nudging fulfills that goal. So nudging is this now very famous way of shaping people's preferences and moving them around, which consists of presenting options in different ways, making the default options in certain ways so that people will stick to them, putting horrible... Have you got any cigarette packages? So putting just horrible pictures in cigarette packages, they're not putting not very nice colors. So this form of discouraging people seems to work, given the shortcomings in irrationality that we suffer. But crucially, they don't appeal to rational persuasion, they don't involve economic incentives, and they leave choices open. So the idea is that you don't actually coerce anyone, you just move them around a bit and manage to get them to do whatever you want them to do. Now, one feature of nudging is that the nudge should be easily resistible. So people think, or someone like Joshua Sagai argues that for something to be a nudge instead of a push or a shove, has to be easily resistible. And what that means is that people should basically effortlessly be able to resist the temptation or the push to do something if they don't want to do that. Right? So those who want to smoke, the fact that they have these pictures in the cigarette shouldn't make any difference to their willingness to smoke. It should be effective only those who want to give up smoking. Think another case. Imagine that in the supermarket you put kind of healthy stuff, salads and apples at eye level, and then you put the unhealthy stuff at the bottom. So chocolate cake goes to the bottom. Then the idea is that people are more likely to eat healthy stuff. Right? So you have people who want to be healthy and they just pick the salads easily. Nevertheless, those who still want to eat chocolate cake, they can easily just pick up the cake. So it shouldn't basically involve much effort. If that is true, then it would be great. You could have some sort of personalized paternalism. But then the question is whether it is true that nudging is always effortlessly. One option is, of course, to say, well, this is an empirical question. One option is that it may be just an empty set and useless in that respect. But perhaps it isn't. So now notice that nudging, if it's true that nudging just helps people to do whatever they want, and there is in general a permissible, there is a general permission for soft paternalism, this is open to a variety of policies. So it is open, for instance, to that the state could just subsidize people to sign up for companies which provides personalized nudges. Right, so imagine there are some companies, for instance, who make sure that you are banned from casinos. Then I think it's okay for the state to subsidize you, to give you vouchers so that you can sign up for different companies. It need not only be in cases of smoking or eating cake. It could be also, imagine there is a religious group who values celibacy. So I think it would be okay for the state to design condoms in ways that just really put these people off sex and using them. And the idea is that it will only affect those who don't want to have premarital sex, but it will leave everyone untouched. So it doesn't violate autonomy in that sense. So it doesn't violate neutrality in that sense. Now, the question is, what happens when the policy actually affects other people? So when there are some externalities. So one problem with these policies is that on the one hand it has externalities. It might affect some people who are not supposed to be affected. And the other problem is that it is not 100% effective. It might be that someone who wants to give up smoking still smokes despite of the nudge. Someone who really wants to eat chocolate cake might not be able to resist. And that seems very likely. So Sarah Condy, who is a defender of coercive paternalism, has made that argument against nudging. What she says is, nudging is less than 100% effective. Those who want to give up smoking and are unaffected by the nudge have a complaint against the state. The state is not doing enough to help them. So then we have two different policies. One is, and the justification is the same, just help people to do whatever they want. On the one hand, you can coerce people, banning chocolate cake or cigarettes. On the other hand, you have just some nudging. So once you take into account the externalities, What it seems that these policies do is just distribute the cost and the opportunities for autonomy. If you ban cigarettes, those who still want to smoke will be unable to do it. If you nudge against nudging, some of those who want to give up smoking will keep smoking. So what we need to do is just to find a way to distribute these kinds of opportunities. Now, so Sarah Conley makes a strange argument. And what she thinks is that in the case of smoking, we can discount the interests of smokers. And the reason she thinks is that no one has an interest in smoking, which is not the outcome of addiction. So all of us who have smoked at some point, we know that the first time you smoked is just really horrible. Pleasure just gets as you get hooked into tobacco. And that, she thinks, because no one has a legitimate interest in smoking, it's just because of addiction, then the interests of smokers don't count. And coercing those who want to give up smoking is fine. But I think so that doesn't seem to be a very liberal view, because I tend to think that liberals should appeal to actual preferences rather than an ideal preference. So it is true that ideally no one should be hooked to tobacco. There is no good reason to be hooked to tobacco. But in fact, the fact that some people are hooked to tobacco, I think, is sufficiently weighty for liberals. So that doesn't mean, of course, that all actual preferences should be taken into account. But it means that actual preferences have to be taken into account. Liberals, I think, shouldn't appeal to ideal preferences. So that argument wouldn't work. So now let's go back to the case in which we had to distribute the opportunities for autonomy. So a consequentialist will say, well, let's just maximize. The decision should depend on which brings more autonomy, which brings overall lack of autonomy. So I'm not a consequentialist, so I don't like that choice. So what I think is we need to find a principle that fairly tell us how to distribute this cost. And then one way to do that might appeal to Scanlon's view, which is the value of choice. So Scanlon's view is that it's fair that someone bears a cost, provided that they have an opportunity to avoid bearing that cost, provided we have done enough to prevent them doing that cost. So first, this view is not a retributive view. It's not the view that those who are reckless deserve to suffer or deserve to bear cost. It's just the view that when someone will bear a cost, it is fair that those who could have avoided bearing the cost bear it instead of others. They are more liable to suffer the cost, so to speak. So, going back to the paternalist case, it seems that nudging makes fares better than coercive paternalism. The argument is that by imposing the nudge, we give an opportunity to those who want to give up smoking for giving up. The fact that they fail to do it makes them liable to bear the cost. Whereas if you just ban cigarettes, we don't give the happy smokers or the happy chocolate eaters an opportunity to do what they want, and they are unfairly disadvantaged. So that is, I think, it's a general structure for thinking that in general nudging or more flexible policies are better than coercive policies. And that seems a more liberal argument and step to reject the new wage for paternalism. Yeah, so that's the argument. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
For accepting.
It was some sort of duty, so I will begin my presentation with its division. So at the beginning I will try to give some sort of definition of what is liberalism, or at least how it is being read in this paper. Then I will proceed with the 19th century definitions of an individual, which are not derived only from socio-political tracts or philosophical texts of the era, but also from juridical texts, medical manuals, reform manuals, narratives, scientific papers, and the like. So I will use quite a lot of archival material. Then the whole presentation is focused on the individual, but its latter part is going to be very much focused on it, with the aim to provide an answer, a possible answer to the key question: and that is, can we ever say that individual is a neutral category which applies to anyone and everyone? And I would wish to introduce the concept of the right to the title of an individual, so being an individual as an entitlement. In her 1989 text, Liberalism of Fear, Judith Clark says, "Before we can begin to analyze any specific form of liberalism, we must surely state as clearly as possible what the word means. For in the course of so many years of ideological conflict, it seems to have lost its identity completely. Overuse and overextension have rendered it so amorphous that it can now serve as an all-purpose word, whether of abuse or praise." End of quote. To this wholesale ambiguity, we may add Duncan's Bell's astute estimate that liberalism has become the meta-category of Western political discourse. In Duncan Bell's very useful text published last year, What is Liberalism?, he gives a contextual analysis of the term and traces how the mainly forgotten histories of the concept meandered and vacillated. At one point, he claims that at the turn of the 20th century, so 100 years ago, the dominant prescriptive narrative about liberalism in the English-speaking world identified it as a product of the late 18th and early 19th century. However, at the turn of the 21st century, so 15 years ago, the dominant narrative views it as a product of the mid-17th century or earlier. In the former perspective, the French and American revolutions and the global spread of capitalism played a starring role. In the latter, the most important events seem to be the Glorious Revolution of the 1688 and the religious wars in Europe. So, at the turn of the 20th century, utility, democracy, and political economy were the guiding topics. At the turn of the 21st century, those were the natural rights, the social contract, and constitutionalism. In the former, radicals like Jeremy Bentham took center stage. In the latter, it's almost invariably John Locke, widely acclaimed for fathering liberalism. Now, Bell's central claim that a transition from one conception to the other tells us much about the trajectory of modern politics, the sociology of knowledge, and the historicity of theoretical categories is in itself important and intriguing. However, I'm using it here only in order to underpin my own narrowing of this all-purpose word, and I wish to see what it is that the genealogical rereading of this, the turn of the 20th century vantage point, can offer us today. This turn of the 20th century vantage point finds the core of liberalism in reform, utility, and autonomy of individuals. And I stress the last word. It is specifically linked to the United Kingdom Whig tradition, which would later in the 19th century become recognized in the parliamentary politics of the Liberal Party. Theoretically, it was associated first with a small but very vocal and publicly very important group of Bentham's followers called philosophic radicals. Early John Stuart Mill, when he was young, and his father, when he was old, were forming the core of this group. But most importantly, juridically and normatively, its tenet lived through non-revolutionary laws, reform laws, and social policies, which were predominant until at least 1870s. This is closely related to what Foucault terms the technology of government when he defines utilitarianism in his The Birth of Biopolitics. Now, as Bell says, echoing legions of Victorian politicians and thinkers, liberal was increasingly utilized to describe the politico-economic demands of the emergent middle classes. This positioning of liberalism, what is here referred to as a specific vantage point, is important in order to allow us to approach the central concept of this presentation, the concept of an individual. This category is the one that precedes or comes before central concepts in liberal theory, such as autonomy, liberty, rights, etc. It is almost always taken for granted that the individual is a sort of empty, distinctionless mental which falls on each and every one of us. That was so in a fictional state of nature, that is so today. Individuals are the holders of the natural or non-transferable rights. But my aim is to revisit this assumption and to ask who is the holder of the rights, who is the bearer of autonomy, who is the owner of his, and male pronoun is used deliberately here and throughout the text. So who is the owner of his own life and liberty? I want to show that asking who is an individual is not a superfluous rhetorical question. Also, I want to state that this analysis does not merit solely historical value, but is relevant for us nowadays when almost all of the prerogatives of the welfare state or the real socialist state, those social and political organizations that came after the 19th century liberal state, when they fade away. Being an individual is again becoming a certain kind of a privileged position or an entitlement. Now, invoking the turn of the 20th century vantage point was important because I argue that the embodiment of an individual is the product of the 19th century, liberal thought and practice. I will first list the common definitions which were in use throughout that century and specifically until the emergent social arrangements which facilitated the introduction of the welfare state later in the 20th century. And then I will enumerate and briefly explain the conditions of possibility of the emergence of an individual, defined thus, at precisely this time. Now, these are the definitions. So the most encompassing one would be that the individual is the only real owner of his own persona and affairs. This ownership is founded on his fundamental knowledge of his own interest, agency and capacity for autonomous representation. Then a very important one, which was exposed and expounded in Mill's, for example, in Mill's essay on liberty, where individual is defined as a sovereign. This is the attribute of an individual, very important one. Then individual is the one who has the capacity for self-improvement, who strives to be better than he is and who can be better than he is, because he has this kind of ought to be better than he is. This one is, for example, found very often in very different kinds of reform manuals, which were circulating widely during this era. Then, individual is the one who has the capacity for self-control, self-creation, self-actualization, and for a continuous internal reform. This is, of course, related to being better than one already is. Then, possessive individual, of course, defined by C.B. Macpherson, which can be best put as the individual who is the sole owner of himself. I will come back later to this point, but I want us to make us think what kind of property is he the sole owner of? What is that he possesses? Now I will give 3 more definitions which are less abstract than those 5 that I already offered and which are more historically embedded, but you will see that they are also connected to the first, let us say, abstract definitions of the individual. So, individual is the one who can publicize his voice either as the maker or the producer of the public sphere. In order to support this claim, I will cite Eric Hobsbawm in his Age of Capital, where he says, "The single representative of bourgeoisie who thought himself fit to comment on public affairs knew that his letter to the Times or a Neue Freie Presse would reach the greatest part of his own class and the decision makers. But he also knew that his letter would be published because he had a position of an individual." End of quote. Then, because he was the best arbiter in the matters of his own interest, he was formally allowed to represent those interests politically. Thus, an individual is, by extension, also the possessor of civic and political rights, as defined, for example, by T.S. Marshall in his groundbreaking text on citizenship. Finally, and maybe most controversially, Individual is the private person, owner of his own privacy, owner of the decision what part of his own privacy and when he will make public. Now, because of the lack of time, I will now only enumerate and very briefly explain the conditions of possibility which enabled such definitions of individual. What follows is a context of the emergence of an individual in the 19th century. This context, reread thoroughly genealogically, demonstrates that the individual is not applicable to everybody. Those definitions are informed by and immersed in certain norms and knowledges which delimit the space of its universal application. The category of an individual is constituted by several large and all-encompassing processes which, of course, affected many other things, not only the formation or the constitution of an individual. So the first one is the transformation of the political. By this, I mean the historically situated transfer of the sovereignty from the sovereign, being the monarch, to the sovereign individuals. Laissez-faire, as a maxim, could not have been possible without the conception of sovereignty of those who were to be let go. Second, laissez-faire as a new system of economic reasoning and commodity transactions is the second constituent of an individual. In order to have an individual who is the sole owner of his own interest, there had to be the space where free circulation of interests, i.e. property and capital, had been possible. This is, of course, attributable to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. The third constituent is the post-Enlightenment application through legislation, but also through non-juridical forms of reform action, of the principle of perfectibility, apparently egalitarian. Anybody can be better than he is, but in actual fact oversaturated with the norms of what constitutes being better than, which proves to be deeply, even ontologically, inegalitarian. The fourth constituent is the transformation of the Commonwealth. We can call Commonwealth the old form of the state, with monarch as the single sovereign, into the state, or the modern state, or the state as we know it, which we may also call the birth of the modern state. One of the effects, not the only one of course, one of the effects of this process was the construction of the sharp distinction between those who are able to act for themselves and in their own best interests, which a fortiori can, so it was believed, could be also the interest of the whole, and on the other hand, those who had to be cared for and catered by the state. So this is this strange and often forgotten feature of the liberal state in the 19th century, that it was minimal and maximal at the same time, but for different sorts of people, so to say. And those visible symbols or architectural signs of this catering of the state for some sort of persons were, of course, workhouses and prisons as embodiments of this kind of care. The fifth constituent is the transformation of the politics of domesticity, deeply entangled with a new understanding of privacy and publicity, home, and asymmetrical and fundamentally inegalitarian positioning of the sexes. And finally, at the level where norms and knowledges intertwine, the neutrality and universal applicability of the category of an individual could have been achieved through the volatile and ever-expanding idea of reform, which was practically the central idea of the 19th century liberalism. Those who are as yet not individuals may become ones on the condition of the good implementation of reform policies. However, during the 19th century, not everyone seems to have been considered an individual. Close reading of the archival material reveals that only those who belonged to propertied classes were recognized as equal owners of interest, because they were not cared for and catered by the state. They were considered perfectible because they had the qualities of self-control and self-creation, which most of the so-called lower order lacked, and it was explained by their own very nature. And I'm going to quote Marx from the text Private Property and Communism, where he says, "A being only considers himself independent when he stands on his own feet, and he stands only on his own feet when he owes his existence to himself. A man who lives by the grace of another regards himself as a dependent being. But I live completely by the grace of another if I owe him not only the maintenance of my life, but if he has, moreover, created my life, if he is the source of my life. The creation is therefore an idea very difficult to dislodge from popular consciousness. The fact that nature and man exist on their own account is incomprehensible to it because it contradicts everything tangible in practical life." End of quote. Or, the representatives of the weaker sex, weaker quote unquote, again, by its very nature, distinctively different from the individuals, could not have had an interest of their own because it was juridically subsumed by someone else's interest, most often their husbands, and law considered them not as the owners of property, but as the mere parts of someone else's property. Lower stages of civilization, and I'm being ironical here on purpose, everyone and anyone born in the part of the globe other than Northwest and born with anything less than white skin were also considered to lack the possibility to be better. Charity missionary work notwithstanding, their deficient nature banned their rise in perfectibility, as the proponents of the highest Western scientific achievements were prone to declare. So, when we say that the individual is the sovereign and perfectible owner of his own interests, who knows them and acts in accordance with them, and is therefore granted the right to represent himself, the right to be a citizen, and the right to be the sole owner of his own privacy, who are we exactly talking about? Let me conclude. When from the late 1980s onwards, government decided to stop with the politics of dependence. They called for individuals to use their freedom to self-actualize, and I'm quoting Tony Blair here, and to depend only on their own wits and capacities to face the global insecurities. It is repeated time and again that the welfare of the individuals is best secured and promoted when they are prompted to be independent, to use all their might and imagination to care for themselves and their families. Who is this contemporary? Now, let us think of the turn of the 21st century vantage point here. Who is this contemporary individual, autonomous, independent, self-possessing, and self-created, who is the master of his own and his family well-being? I argue that this new Victorian language urges us to meticulously revisit its source. Going back there enables us to understand that being an individual is not attributable to anyone and everyone. That being an individual assumes being embodied in a certain way and having certain privileges. Maybe now is the time to rethink the entitlements of those who can claim that they are autonomous, independent, and self-actualized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, as the title suggests, I would like to briefly examine the compatibility of liberalism and what I call the strongly intersubjectivist conception of autonomy. We heard a bit about the intersubjectivist conception of autonomy in the first presentation, and what I like to do here is to examine two types of intersubjectivist conception of autonomy. Basically, one can be called Hegelian, broadly speaking, and the other could be called Habermasian or Kantian. And each one of these two, and they are complementary in my opinion, each one of these has a weak variety and a strong variety. And so my argument is that liberalism can easily accommodate both of the weak varieties of the intersubjectivist conception of autonomy, but has much more problems when it comes to the strongly intersubjectivist conceptions, both the Hegelian and the Kantian one. So let me first clarify these few of the main concepts. By autonomy, I mean primarily two dimensions of autonomous action: moral autonomy in the sense of moral self-determination, the ability to reflectively appropriate universalizable norms of action, and ethical autonomy, a more substantive dimension which includes the ability to articulate comprehensive worldviews and goals of action without being unduly influenced by others. So also to reflectively appropriate goals and worldviews. And now let me just clarify what I mean by liberalism. So I'm relying here on two primary sources. One is the article by a Finnish author called Antti Kaupinen with the title The Social Dimension of Autonomy, and the other is the article by Irish philosopher Maeve Cook with the title Political Authority and Autonomy. So Kaupinen is a Hegelian, and he develops a critique of Axel Honneth, a more famous neo-Hegelian social theorist. And Maeve Cook is a Habermasian, and she tries to expand Habermas's conception of intersubjective autonomy. So to start from Kaupinen, I take over the definition of what he calls generic liberalism, characterized by three basic principles. So first, basic liberties are to be guaranteed to everyone by granting rights that trump utilitarian considerations of maximizing general welfare. Second, the state is to be maximally neutral between competing rights-respecting conceptions of the good. And finally, distributive inequalities are acceptable so long as they are consistent with fair equality of opportunity, so that the resulting distribution is choice-sensitive but endowment-insensitive. So it seems, and Kaupinen argues in his article, that liberalism is an easy target to shoot at, but a hard one to hit. Its commitment to providing everyone with the basic goods needed for autonomy gives it a great deal of flexibility in response to conceptions that add more conditions to the list, including the intersubjectivist conceptions. So if something really is necessary for the autonomous pursuit of any kind of good life, the liberal will, or at least should, happily adopt it. Now, let's turn to these different conceptions of the intersubjectivist conceptions of autonomy. Now, what do I mean by weak intersubjectivism? A weak intersubjectivist conception of autonomy is the one which argues that there are certain conditions necessary for the formation of subjects capable of autonomous action. So the stress is on the process of socialization. And these accounts can also be called developmentalist accounts of autonomy, because as this previous definition implies, they add more conditions to the possibility of acting autonomously than the ones classical liberalism defines. So let's first turn to a weak Hegelian intersubjectivist conception of autonomy. Well, I would say that the most famous contemporary weak intersubjectivist Hegelian conception of autonomy is the one developed by Axel Honneth in his earlier works, most famous one being The Struggle for Recognition. So Honneth argues that what an individual needs for being able to act autonomously is a certain positive moral practical self-relation that not every one of us can have. This positive moral practical self-relation consists of three dimensions, and all of them have to do with individual psychology. The first one Honneth calls basic self-esteem, basic personal self-esteem. So a subject cannot have basic self-confidence as a necessary precondition for acting autonomously if one has not obtained a certain degree of emotional care and affection in the process of socialization. The second dimension is the one of what Honneth calls self-respect, and has to do with obtaining a certain status, a certain status as a morally accountable person that has an equal weight in social interaction compared with all other subjects involved in interaction. So the self-respect dimension has to do with institutionalized principles of egalitarian identification of subjects. And this is a precondition for one's being able to act in an autonomous way in the dimension of moral self-determination. And the third dimension is what Honneth calls self-esteem, and has to do with one's ability to positively identify and value the goals of action and the characteristics necessary for attaining these goals in oneself. So basic self-esteem is obtained by being recognized as a worthwhile member of society and one who is able to contribute to the common good as much as every other subject. And it is guaranteed to everyone if there is what we might call an egalitarian cultural pattern which does not produce marginalized identities. But all these three preconditions of moral and ethical autonomy, although they're intersubjective, that means they have to do with intersubjective recognition, they have to do with, let's say, the ontogenesis of the human subject. So in our process of self-formation, in our socialization process, our ability to develop what we might call the potential of acting autonomously crucially depends on intersubjective relations of recognition. But once these potentials are actualized, once we have become self-confident, self-respected, and self-esteemed, we can actually then pursue moral autonomy and ethical autonomy as I have defined them pretty much individually. So acting autonomously does not anymore constitutively depend on intersubjective relations once we have been formed as subjects. That's why this is a developmentalist neo-Hegelian account of intersubjective preconditions of autonomy. And what Kaupinen does is criticize Honneth for being a weak intersubjectivist. And then he develops in his critique what we might call a strongly intersubjectivist Hegelian conception of autonomy, which is centered around the concept of being at home in the social world. So this is a crucial Hegelian phrase that Kaupinen defines. Being at home in the social world means basically that the environment, the interactive environment in which we move is responsive to our reasons, as he says. Now, such kind of environment constitutes a space of social freedom, let's say. And Honneth himself, in his later works, has developed, of course, this conception of social freedom in some detail in his work, Freedom's Right. So, what is social freedom? Hegel's idea of social freedom possesses, let's say, a degree of correspondence with some pre-theoretical intuitions and experiences which liberal conceptions of freedom and autonomy do not possess to the same extent. So what is this pre-theoretical intuition? For socialized subjects, it must be a kind of self-understandable fact that the degree of their individual freedom and autonomy depends on how responsive their contexts of action are with respect to their goals and intentions. The stronger their impression that their purposes are supported and even carried forth by those others with whom they regularly interact, the more they will come to see their social environment as the space within which their self constantly expands. So this is a rather complicated idea that freedom and autonomy, individual freedom and autonomy, consists in an experience of let's say, what would be the best translation of bei sich selbst im anderen sein, being one with oneself in another, which means the realization that the pursuit of one's own goals in life is not only compatible with others' goals, but that it facilitates the self-realization of one's interactive partners and is in turn facilitated by one's interactive partners. So the crux of this argument is an ontological claim that freedom and autonomy equals a state of emotional fulfillment that comes with intersubjective recognition, but the principal difference between the previously mentioned weakly intersubjectivist conception is that recognition in the previous case only constitutes the precondition of experiencing this state of emotional fulfillment. However, in the strongly intersubjectivist conception, for example, embodied in relations of friendship, according to Honneth and Kaupinen, recognition has a more constitutive role within the practice itself, within the intersubjective relation itself. So one cannot pursue a course of action as a friend except with respect to another person who recognizes her as a friend constantly. So being recognized as a friend is intrinsic to the role of friend, to the very practice of social freedom, to the very practice of interaction in which we reciprocally recognize each other as equal partners in interaction, and in which our self can expand, as previously defined within the Hegelian conception. The existence of such a symmetrical and reciprocal sphere of social interaction as the one of friendship constitutes a certain space for our subjectivity and for the ability of our autonomous agency, which would not be there if the social practice disappeared. So social freedom, according to this strongly intersubjectivist Hegelian conception, is characterized by the quality of complementary reciprocity. So it is not just a sphere of egalitarian recognition of interactive partners, but of a complementary one, which means, as previously defined, each one of us facilitates the self-realization, the ethical self-realization of the other, the pursuit of comprehensive normative worldviews and goals of action. And intersubjectivity is constitutive of the very possibility of pursuing these goals, as seen in the example of friendship. And now let's turn to what I previously defined as the Kantian and Habermasian conceptions of intersubjectivist autonomy. In her article, Political Authority and Autonomy, Maeve Cook first reflects on the classical Habermasian conception of autonomy, which is centered around the idea of communicative reason. So basically, the essence of the weakly intersubjectivist Kantian conception of autonomy is also a developmentalist one, meaning that in the process of socialization, we internalize the principles of communicative reason, which are constitutive of our ability to act autonomously in the previously defined sense of moral self-determination and ethical self-determination. Without being socialized into communicative reason, we are incapable of acting autonomously, and this means, for Habermas, this means that we internalize certain what he calls validity claims, which are universal and which can be also divided into three dimensions: the claim to truth of normative statement, of assertoric statements, normative validity of moral statements, and expressive authenticity of what he calls expressive statements. But once we have mastered once we have internalized communicative reason, it seems that also in the weakly in the Habermasian weakly intersubjectivist conception of autonomy, we can go on acting autonomously even in isolation. And then Cook tries to overcome the limitations of Habermasian intersubjectivism by introducing what she calls the concept of the processual nature of intersubjective autonomy. So according to Cook, liberalism suffers from the classical problem of the Hobbesian conception of political authority. So in the Hobbesian paradigm, freedom comes before political authority. It is prior to political authority, and it does not depend on it. So we can practice freedom and autonomy in perfect isolation, but because of the pressures of collective self-preservation, we basically form the social contract. We subject ourselves willingly to a political authority that has a sovereign characteristic, which means that we kind of voluntarily consent to limiting our individual freedom in the name of collective self-preservation. But in all kinds of political theory that is based on this classical Hobbesian conception, there is this paradox that the goal of theory is to devise conceptions of political authority that would not limit individual freedom, atomistically understood, but which would at the same time restrict any kind of coercion. And this is impossible because any kind of political authority intrinsically limits individual freedom on this account. Now, Habermasian conception is somewhat different, but in the end, since it's a developmentalist conception, since it's not a strongly intersubjectivist conception in itself, it still has this problem that in the end, moral and ethical autonomy are properties of individual action, and as long as they are, any kind of political authority necessarily restricts them. If moral and ethical autonomy are not intersubjectivist through and through, then we can't make an argument that political authority can be constitutive of autonomy. So what Cook does is she argues that it's not just in our process of socialization that we depend on intersubjective relations of communicative rationality. It's throughout we rely on them throughout our lives. And this is because exchanging arguments and practicing moral and ethical autonomy basically depends on constantly redeeming Habermasian validity claims in everyday contexts of interaction, which basically means that the norms that we reflectively endorse, their validity still depends on relations of argumentation and our attempts to redeem the validity claims intrinsic in these arguments. If these validity claims are not constantly redeemed, then the normative status of our own reflectively endorsed goals of action, let's say, deteriorates. So this is how she defines it. By reciprocally opening up their ethical reasons to the critical judgment of others, human agents engage in processes of intersubjective reasoning that are partly constitutive of their validity. And in making rational accountability a requirement of autonomous agency, Cook argues, I not only incorporate a subject transcending moment, I also tie the autonomy of the individual human agent to certain kinds of relations with other humans. And if these relations are not constantly there, we are not morally and ethically autonomous anymore. And this kind of perspective goes beyond the previously mentioned developmentalist claim that human subjectivity is formed in webs of social relations. The stronger claim Cook makes is that she ties autonomy to rational accountability so that the autonomy of the individual human agent is constituted through interaction with other humans. And on this processual interpretation, autonomy, even Habermasian autonomy, consists less in reaching consensus on the norms, laws, and policies determining the common good than in the deliberative process itself. So this would be a strong intersubjectivist Habermasian conception of autonomy. And we can see now that it's pretty complementary with the earlier mentioned Hegelian strongly intersubjectivist conception of autonomy, in the sense that as I argued before, the strong intersubjectivist Hegelian conception requires certain institutionalized spheres of intersubjective action, certain roles, certain spaces of complementary reciprocity, which are, so to say, which are the very stuff of which autonomous agency is made. Without these protected legally protected spheres of interaction, we can't practice moral and ethical autonomy. And then, of course, the strongly Habermasian intersubjectivist conception argues that the way this practice unfolds is through communicative rationality. So complementary reciprocity can only be established on the basis of communicative rationality and the constant redeeming of the normative validity claims inherent in linguistic statements. This is how I would argue for a complementarity between the Hegelian and Kantian strongly intersubjectivist conceptions of autonomy. Now, in conclusion, I would just like to pose the question of the compatibility of liberalism and this, let's say, comprehensive Hegelian Kantian intersubjectivist conception of autonomy. As I mentioned in introduction, liberalism can easily accommodate any kind of a developmentalist account. For example, Gerald Dworkin encourages philosophers to suggest empirical hypotheses about what psychological and social conditions are likely to promote the development and maintenance of autonomous individuals. So there seems to be no essential philosophical difference between weak intersubjectivism and traditional individualism, only a different focus of attention and the reliance on empirical theories in the case of the former. However, in the strongly intersubjectivist conception, I see two problems. One has to primarily do with the Habermasian dimension, and the other one has to do with the Hegelian dimension. So, the Habermasian dimension, the systemic reason, it's a concept that Habermas introduces and contrasts with communicative reason. Systemic reason means the functional interlacing of the consequences of individual actions behind the backs of social actors. So it has nothing to do with argumentation, with exchange of arguments, or with validity claims. It has to do with collective self-preservation. It has to do with maximizing the efficiency of social action. And the capitalist market, of course, is based on systemic reason, on the institutionalized form of systemic reason. And then the question is, what does liberalism has to say about this? If we say that intersubjectivist conception of autonomy sounds empirically persuasive to us, empirically adequate, then if we also agree that in our reflections on the good society we have to deal with what sociologists call a social order of reproduction, an order of socioeconomic reproduction, not just with what we call political authority. So if we have to deal with also systemic reason and how to institutionalize certain regimes of socioeconomic reproduction, then how do we deal with this problem of systemic reason, which kind of has a tendency to expand and disrupt communicative rationality, disrupt reasoning, and disrupt any kind of complementary reciprocity that we can find in certain social practices. And then there is the Hegelian problem, and that is the problem of domination. Domination that is inherent in any kind of social order that is based on the principle on the value form, which means, of course, the market society. Any kind of social order which is based on this institutionalized principle will necessarily produce what we might call axes of differentiation, which establish hierarchies. And, of course, economic exploitation is the first such axis, but there is also the axis of marginalization, the production of marginalized identities, since in any kind of society based on value form, we can't have an anti-hierarchical pattern of cultural valuation of, let's say, professional identities. Certain identities will have to be valued higher than others. And this, of course, is no problem for a weakly intersubjectivist conception of autonomy, because moral autonomy and ethical autonomy can be practiced in isolation. As such, they do not. The practice of autonomy can escape certain institutionalized forms of domination, marginalization, etc. But in a strongly intersubjectivist conception, all subjects have to have access to spheres of complementary reciprocity and spheres of communicative reason. And if they are denied this to any extent, they will not be able to practice autonomy. So for a strongly intersubjectivist conception of autonomy, both the existence of systemic reason and its expansion and the existence of any kind of power differentials are a fundamental threat to the practice of autonomy. And the question then is, how does liberalism address is, can liberalism do without, can liberalism accommodate alternative conceptions of socioeconomic reproduction than the market society? Thank you.